So, Trev, that's done. That's over with. They signed Marcus Freeman. He's good to go. Now we can dive into the Notre Dame matchup with the offense against the Indiana defense. And Trev, this, just looking at a big picture, this is a huge, huge matchup. Like, obviously in a playoff game, both sides of the ball are big matchups. Like, they're huge matchups. But the Notre Dame defense against the Indiana offense is going to be a huge matchup as well. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. But we do expect there to be some level of they're both going to have some level of success against each other. Notre Dame's going to have their moments. The defense is going to have their moments. I think this matchup right here is without a doubt the most impactful matchup in whether or not Notre Dame can win this football game, because a lot of the talk about Indiana, when you look at kind of their success this season, a lot of people talk about their offense, but not enough people talk about how good their defense has been this season. And you can talk all you want about them, played anybody, and all those things are true. They have not really played any elite offenses, and I don't think Ohio State is an elite offense this season either. You and I have talked a lot about that this season, but they haven't played a lot of teams that are great scoring teams. But I don't care who you're playing. When you're giving up 14.7 points per game in a Power 5 conference like the Big Ten, I don't care if you are playing the bottom half of that league, and you're only giving up 244.8 yards per game and 4.1 yards per play. Trevor, I don't care what league you're in. That's really good. Yeah. I don't care what part of the league you're playing. That's really good. And the Notre Dame offense, which for much of the season has been considered the weak spot of the team, even though statistically it doesn't necessarily look that way, you're able to say, listen, you beat up on a lot of inferior opponents. You're saying the same thing about the Notre Dame offense that people are saying about the Indiana defense. And I think both of them are very good units. But this has not been the strength of Notre Dame team for much of the year. Can they get this part of the team really rolling? It's like Riley Leonard said the other day, I don't feel like I've played my best football yet. Well, he hasn't, and this offense hasn't. Is that going to – it may never happen. Does it happen now? We don't know. But this matchup, just kind of big picture, Trevor, this is going to be huge for so many reasons. This is going to be huge and a big part of this game. If Notre Dame wins this game – unless their defense just plays elite lights out and they win a 17-14 game, I think the offense is going to really have to be at its best, which makes the matchup against what is a pretty good Indiana defense very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the offense is the key to victory for me. I mean, big picture, and obviously some people, you have to score points to win a football game, and absolutely true. But then you go back through and you look, and to your point about the defense playing lights out, we watched Notre Dame lose a football game where the defense allowed 16 points, one offensive touchdown.
We've seen that a lot more than people would like to admit the last few years. Mm-hmm. I mean, they lost to Ohio State last year, giving up, 17 points?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
they lost to Stanford in 22, giving up 16 points. So it's just – you go through and you look at what this team needs.
They gave up 19 offensive points to Marshall as well, if you remember that game. They only gave up 19 points to Marshall's offense. Mm-hmm. Only held Ohio State to 24 points the year before. We've seen a lot of games. And Trev, to your point, it's not just about, you got to score. It's you can score a lot of points not playing at your best against a lot of teams on your schedule. It's can you play at your best when you're playing against the best? That's really what the question is.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you keep the football on the field? Can you sustain drives? I mean, we talked yesterday at length about the lack of depth in the Notre Dame cornerback room and how IU has an arsenal of receivers. You need to help out your defense. You need to sustain drives. You need to eat the clock. I mean, there's a lot of things that the offense needs to do that is just outside of the realm of, they have to score touchdowns, of course, right? So it's massive, Not only is it going to be a battle on the field, it's a battle in narratives. I think you hit the nail on the head for IU's defense. Yeah, I mean, they held nobody to 14.6 points. You talk about Notre Dame's offense. Yeah, they scored 39.8 points a game versus a bunch of nobodies. So obviously something's going to have to give, right? And so I'm excited to dive into it with you and talk about how can that give in Notre Dame's favor, what that's going to look like. It's going to be a good one today, man. I'm excited.
No question. So when we first talk about this offense, this matchup, let's first kind of go over both of these units. And when you first start off, Trev, it really comes down to the matchup of the run games. the Notre Dame run defense against or rush offense against the Indiana run defense. This is a super intriguing matchup. And you look at the numbers here as we dive into this part of the matchup, and statistically, it's great. It's not even just good on good; it's great on great. And you're talking about a Notre Dame offense that ranks 10th in the country in rushing yards per game at 224.8. And if you dive into it a little bit further, you realize that number is actually even more impressive when you take several factors into consideration. Number one is Notre Dame is the number 3 rushing offense at the Power 5 level, Power 4 level. Numbers 1 through 7 are all G5 schools: Army, Jack State, Liberty, New Mexico, UNLV, Boise State, and Navy. It's not till UCF at 8 and then Tennessee at 9 that you start to get where Notre Dame is. And then the next closest team behind Notre Dame is Kansas, down at 211 yards all the way down to 13. But then the other thing that I look at is Trev, is when you look at games against teams that where they only played Power 5 teams, Notre Dame jumps up to 5th in rushing yards in 8 games against Power 4 teams at 220.9 yards per game. And the 4 teams ahead of them are all G5 teams that only played 1 to 3 games. Boise State played 3, New Mexico played 3, Air Force played 2, James Madison played 1. Notre Dame is head and shoulders above those teams. The other teams in the league, the next closest behind Notre Dame is 7 yards behind them. And then when you look at yards per carry, same type of deal. If you just look at all games, Notre Dame ranks 3rd in yards per carry. Only New Mexico and Boise State are ahead of them. And Boise State with Ashton Jeanty is 0.02 ahead of Notre Dame. Notre Dame is at 6.30. Boise State's at 6.32. And then if you also look, the next closest Power 5, so Notre Dame is number 3, but they're number 1 amongst Power 4 teams. The next closest team behind Notre Dame in yards per carry, Notre Dame at 6.3, is Kansas State at 5.86. Behind them is UCF at 5.77. The next closest Power 5 team is Louisville, all the way down at number 11 at 5.6 yards per carry. So I just think it puts context into just how good Notre Dame has been. And it's the same story too, Trev, when you look at them against G5 and against Power 4 games. Notre Dame is the 4th overall team in yards per carry against in games where your opponent was a Power 4 team. The only 3 ahead of them were Boise, New Mexico, Louisiana, Lafayette. Notre Dame was a 5.99. The next closest to Notre Dame amongst P4 teams was K-State at 5.51. So it just kind of gives you some context about how dynamic and how explosive and how good this Notre Dame offense has been all season at running the football. And there's a lot of reasons why, but these numbers in a lot of ways, Trevor, speak for themselves for this Notre Dame offense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this goes to show the evolution of this offense as well, because at the start of the season, we went through and we talked about how Notre Dame needs to figure out a way to be a more efficient running team, right? Because before it was a lot of those, 1 yard gain, 2 yard gain, 1 yard lost, 46-yard run. And now when you go and you look at some of these numbers, I think it speaks to, especially in the last 4 games, they have gotten really, really good at building around an efficient run game. So now it's not just big plays. Now, if you watch the team and you watch the games, you know that they are chock full of big plays. You got Jadarian Price housing from 40 yards out. You have Jeremiah Love jumping over people. You have Riley Leonard trying to jump over people. But, you go through and you look at what this team has been able to do on the ground and its evolution throughout the season, gives you really good confidence. I've been tooting this horn since championship weekend. The teams that have been able to run the ball for the most part in big games like this have been able to prevail. So the way I see it, it's complementary. It's an and, but when you have that foundation that Notre Dame has with their run game, it makes it all the more interesting. And when you look at IU's defense, this is from a statistical matchup. This is what you want a playoff game to look like, right? Like you want it to look like this. It's best on best. They have multiple statistics for rushing offense and rushing defense when you compare the two that rank inside of the top 10. You go through and you look at Notre Dame ranks where they do in runs of 30 yards or more. You look at where IU ranks in the runs of 30 yards or more that they've given up. So it puts you in a really fun spot to look and say, you know what? Name aside, I get that it's IU, whatever. I don't care who they played. These are the kind of matchups that you want to see when you get into the postseason.
Well, Trev, to put numbers to what you just said, and you look at this Notre Dame offense and what it has done in big plays, Notre Dame ranks tied for 4th in most runs of 30-plus yards or more. There's only one Power 4 team tied with them, and that is Baylor at 16. Baylor had 30 more carries this season than did Notre Dame. Every other team ahead of them or tied with them, Jack State is tied. They've played 13 games. Navy is ahead of them with one more. They've played the same number of games, but they've run the ball a lot more. They're a G5 team. UNLV, who played 13 games, has 20. Boise State, who's played 13 games and has the best back in college football, has 20 as well. And then you look at where they rank in gains of 40 yards or more. They're tied for 5th. There's only one Power 5 team Power 4 team ahead of them. That's Louisville at 12. Cincinnati's tied with them at 10. If you look at where they rank in most runs of 50 yards or more, they're tied for 2nd with South Alabama and Navy. Only Boise State is ahead of them. Here's a crazy stat. Notre Dame is tied for 2nd at 7. Next is Boise State, who has 13, thanks to Ashton Jeanty. Notre Dame is also tied for 3rd in most runs of 60 yards or more with 5. They're tied with Miami of Ohio, which shocked me when I saw that, who's played 13 games. And then Navy is 2nd with 6. And then Boise State is number 1 with 11, which is a really wild number. And then Notre Dame is also tied for 6th in most gains of 70 or more. They have 2. Boise has 5. I just want to put that into context to just remind people of how amazing Ashton Jeanty was this season. But it just kind of shows you that Notre Dame has been a really dynamic offense all season long. And it's not one guy. This is about Boise State. It's all from one guy. I mean, that's not it's not somehow some sort of backhanded insult against Boise State. It's why would you give anyone else the football if you have Ashton Jeanty on your football team? It's more so just saying like how special he was. But what makes Notre Dame so difficult, in my opinion, Trevor, is that they have so many different guys that can do it. And, we obviously, I'm looking at Boise right now. They have only one other ball carrier went over 50 yards, was not him, and that was Dylan Riley, who's a backup running back. But when you look at it, Trev, it's what makes Notre Dame unique is that it's Jeremiah Love, it's Jadarian Price, it's Riley Leonard, can all rip off big plays. And then they just put in, Aeneas Williams in the game against at the time, the number 3 rush defense in the country. And he comes in and he goes for a 50-plus yard touchdown run. And I promise you, if you put Kedron Young in the game behind the first team offensive line, he'd be able to go for big plays. That's what makes him so dangerous, is that it's not just one guy. You can bottle up Jeremiah Love, as we pointed out in the Florida State game. Florida State bottled up Jeremiah Love. They did as good a job as any team in college football this year at bottling up Jeremiah Love. He had 9 carries and had 19 yards on 9 carries. Think about that. But then Jadarian Price comes in and rips off a 65-yard touchdown run and goes 7 carries for 95 yards. Riley Leonard rushes for 70 yards on 11 carries. And next thing you know, that's 165 rushing yards on 18 carries from 2 guys not named Jeremiah Love. Right? So you can put all that energy in trying to stop Jeremiah Love, and it doesn't matter because somebody else is going to step up. That's what's been the story all season. It wasn't Jeremiah that sparked the offense against A&M. It was Jadarian Price. And then Jeremiah put that game away with back-to-back 20-yard runs to end that game, basically. And that's what makes this run game so difficult to defend. And I think as the season has gone on, they've gotten more and more efficient because the line is playing more consistently. Early in the season, Trevor, it was 2-yard run, -1, 3-yard run, 1-yard run, 50, because they were a very inefficient offense. And the line was a big reason for that. They'd have a great block and then 2-3, just like, dude, what are you doing? As the season has worn on, Joe Rudolph's unit has gotten a lot better at just getting those 4- and 5-yard gains as well. Those are huge. Instead of going for -1 or +2 on 1st and 10, now you're getting 4. Now you're getting 5. Those aren't, oh, wow, you're going to kill these teams with 4-yard runs. But that stuff matters because now you're in 2nd and 6 or 2nd and 5, and everything is in front of you. Or it's 2nd and 6, and you rip off another 4-yard run, and now it's 3rd and 2, and you have everything on your playbook is at your disposal on 3rd and 2. Everything. And that's what's made this offense so difficult running the football, is as the line has started to play more cohesively and as a unit. And you look at that last game against USC, Trevor, and some of the run blocks in that game were just like, That's teaching tape right there. That's teaching tape. That's stuff Joe Rudolph is going to be using at some offensive line clinic this summer on how to, you know what I mean, how to block these. He's going to be using the Army and the USC games as teaching tape on how to block inside zone, how to block duo, and things along those lines. And they really had it rolling, and that's really been the big difference. The big plays have been there all year. It's the efficiency that has gotten so much better, which is why Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price and Riley Leonard. Well, not Riley Leonard because they used him differently, but why Price and Love have a higher yards per carry in the last 5 games than they did in the first 6 games is because of that right there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and to further your point about just the different running backs that they have, not only do they have 4 guys, they have 4 guys that all run different, right? Like it's, you talk about it all the time. Football's a game about matchups, and it's really hard to prepare and match up with a team who has 4 guys who can efficiently run the ball that all do it differently. Because there's not one thing that the defense can key on of, oh, hey, this is how you kind of bottle up a Jeremiah Love. Well, you put in 24 and Jadarian Price runs differently than he does. Try to bottle up both of them. Riley Leonard runs different than they both do. From a big picture standpoint, yes, there are all 3. I'll put Aeneas Williams in that conversation too. But the big 3, they're all hard to tackle, but in different ways. Jeremiah Love is a much stronger runner than what he was last year. He's still very elusive. He has, getaway speed once he reaches that next level. Jadarian Price is probably the best lateral cutter on the team. His east-west vision is insane. I think of that touchdown run he had against Army where he broke a tackle in the hole and then just bounced it outside and like that. And then you have a guy like Riley Leonard, who I've said all year, people can't tackle him, and I don't understand why, but they can't. So you have this 3-headed monster attack where they just all do it differently. So, it's a matchup nightmare, man. It really is.
It is funny because it's hard to explain. It's like he doesn't look fast. He doesn't look like the kind of guy you'd expect to be this real dynamic runner, but he is. And he's a lot better athlete than I think a lot of people give him credit for. Yeah. And that makes him a difficult guy to bring down. I don't think people understand how smooth and athletic he really is and how fast he actually is until you face it. And you hear people talk about that all the time. Like, we didn't really understand just how good he was at just how athletic he was or just how fast he was until you watch him play. And that's a big part of what's led them to be successful. But at the end of the day, Trevor, success in the postseason, it's great to have elite backs, but you're going to be playing, at least in Notre Dame's draw, they're going to be playing teams that are pretty good at stopping the run, or at least are at times. Like, you look like a team like Georgia late in the year, they were terrible stopping the running against UMass and Georgia Tech, and then they just dominated Texas. Right? Like, they're a very inconsistent run game. You know that you're going to get the best of what they have to offer in a quarterfinal game, right? If you go play Penn State in the semifinals, or if you go play SMU in the semifinals, those are teams that are really good at stopping the run, or at least for most of the season they've been. So that's going to be part of it, is until maybe the championship game, and that's assuming you get Oregon. You're not. They're a good run defense, but not a great run defense by any stretch. Penn State showed that. Unless Ohio State makes it through or Tennessee makes it through, you're not going to face a great run defense in the championship game either. The first 3 rounds, though, you're going to face very, very good run defenses. And I know there's a lot of skepticism about, is Indiana really that good and things along those lines, Trevor? And it's a lot like the conversation we had about Army. Right. And I'm not saying like, oh, they're going to go run for 270 on 29 carries. No, I'm not saying that. That's a different conversation. What I'm saying is we can say 2 things at once, and 2 things can be very true. One is we can say, look, Indiana has not faced any good rushing offenses all year. We can say that and say that with confidence. And it's honestly, it's not even a thing, Trevor, that's even debatable. I mean, anyone that's got any kind of common sense, any kind of intellectual honesty that covers this Indiana football team should be able to look at them and say, hey, listen, they haven't played any good teams running the football. This year they played, if you look at it in order of highest to lowest, they face the number 59, 69, 93, 95, 104, 106, 110, 110, 118, 123, and number 131 rushing offenses in the country this year. You can say that and say, hey, listen, guys, the reality is they're just not playing a lot of teams that are good at running the football. And you'd be true. You'd be accurate. But they're not the only team in the country, Trevor, that hasn't played a lot of great rushing offenses this year.
Sure.
And nobody touches them when it comes to their rush defense. And we'll pull those numbers up again. Not only do they have the number one rush defense in the country this year, Trevor, it's not really close. I mean, there's not really a close second. They're at 70.8. The next closest is 83. Ole Miss at 83 yards per game. The next closest after them is Michigan at 92. There's only 8 teams in all of college football that are under 100. Tennessee, Ohio State, UCLA, Ohio, SMU, Michigan, and Ole Miss, and then, of course, Indiana. And they're at 70.8. So we'll talk specifically about their schedule, but I think a lot of Notre Dame fans are going to make a mistake if they think that this is just some average run defense that gets by not playing anybody. Because I think it's in 9 of their 12 games, I think 9, maybe 10 of their 12 games, they held their opponents well under their season average in yards per game or in total yards and also yards per carry. And that's the sign of a good run defense is one that, okay, yeah, you play nobody good, but you're not giving up 10 more yards than they all average, and that's why you're top 10. You're holding them all under your season average. And I think we would do a grave disservice if we tried to dismiss how good this Indiana run defense has been all season.
Yeah, I mean, if you use the argument, here's how I look at it, right? If you use the argument that IU hadn't played anybody, that's why their stats are so good, you could, to an extent, use that same argument against Notre Dame, which is why it's not fair, right? Like if Notre Dame's going to get credit for, yes, they didn't really play anybody overly good this year. Like they've played really good football teams, but I don't think they played the elite caliber of football teams. They played some that are close, But if you're going to use that argument for Notre Dame and say, but they blew everybody out, and then look at Indiana's schedule and say, well, they didn't play anybody, so their stats don't mean anything.
Right.
That's when you can't, right? But this all feeds into why this matchup is significantly more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be interesting to see how this one plays out. But I'm with you. I mean, Indiana held. Oh gosh, I broke this down like last week. I think Indiana held like 3 of their opponents to their lowest rushing totals of the season. They held Michigan State to negative 36 yards for the game. So you go through and you look at what they did. I mean, it's nothing short of impressive.
Right.
Regardless of who it is.
Well, perfect example is Ohio State. Ohio State ranks 59th in rushing offense this season. They're the best rushing offense that Indiana's faced all season. And they rank 59th. But they are 28th in the country in yards per carry this season, which I've always said is a better can be a better indicator of your overall success over the course of a season than total yards, because yards talks about usage. And I could point to teams that have rushing offenses that score that have a lot of points, or have a lot of yards, but it's because they run the ball a lot. I mean, you look at some of these teams like Northern Illinois this season ran for 207 yards a game. They were sub 5 per carry because they ran it a lot. Same thing with Tulane this season, right? Same thing with Tennessee. Tennessee was 9th in college football at 232 yards per game, Trevor. They were 7.2 yards ahead of Notre Dame per game. They ran the ball 117 times more than Notre Dame. So do they have a better rushing offense because they average 8 more yards per game than Notre Dame? Or did they just do it a lot more? Like, where would Notre Dame be in total yards per game if they ran the ball the same amount of times as Tennessee did? And that's the thing you look at. Actually, I'm gonna actually do that here, Trevor. I'm gonna tell you what that number would be. But if Notre Dame this season ran the ball as many times as Tennessee did, so let's go here. So 6.30 yards per carry. let's say 545 carries. That's 3,433 yards. Divide that by 12 games. Notre Dame would be averaging 286.1 yards per game. That'd be number 2 in all of college football behind Army. Right? So that's the thing about it is you have to look at context. But you look at that Ohio State team. Yeah, Ohio State didn't run for a ton of yards this year, but they were a pretty good offense when it comes to big plays and yards per play, and they kept them in check in that regard too, Trevor. And that's the whole point about this is you have to be able to look at different aspects of this to evaluate a football team and say, okay, Ohio State didn't run for a lot of yards. They were a high yards per carry team. Ohio State only averaged 3.97 yards per carry against Indiana. They only rushed for 115 yards. So even though they were on a great rushing offense, they held them well below their season average.
And it's also worth noting that I'm pretty sure 50 or 60 of that 115 came late in the fourth quarter when Travion broke one on like their last offensive possession.
Yep. They shut them down. They shut down their run game. And those are the things you got to look at and say, hey, yeah, I know that was Ohio State's third lowest total of the season in total yards. It was also their third lowest yards per carry average of the season. And that's the whole point is you have to be able to look at it and say, no, they haven't played anybody. They haven't played anybody like Notre Dame. There's no doubt about it, but they're still really good. Does that mean they're going to shut Notre Dame down? No, I'm not saying that. It's more about understand what they're facing so you can have proper context to the performance, whatever it is, good or bad. Right? And if Notre Dame rushes for 85 yards, I'm not going to be like, hey, great job. You went 15 over their season average. That will not be unless they did it on like 15 carries because they threw for 400 yards. You know what I'm saying? But most likely that's not going to be what we're going to say. But it's if they rush for 175 yards, you're like, dude, that may have been way under Notre Dame's season average, but that was really good because they went over 100 beyond Indiana's total. So those are the things you look at to properly understand how good this rush defense is, which also puts some importance on how good they're going to be. Because let's talk about why they're good at stopping the run, Trevor. It's not because teams throw all over them, because let's put some numbers here on this one as well. Their pass defense only ranks 9th in college football. So this isn't a team that's given up very few rushing yards because everybody passes on them. Like I think a team that Notre Dame faced that way this year, if I'm being honest with you, is a team like Stanford. I don't know why I say that. It's somebody pointed out to me that I say that a lot. D. Troll Hunter pointed that out to me that I say that a lot, and now I can't stop hearing it every time I say it. And it bothers me now. So thanks a lot, D. Troll Hunter. You're in my head now. You're in my head. But when you look at the numbers, for example, Stanford ranks 39th in college football in yards allowed per game. Right? It's a pretty good number. Rushing, but they're 70th in yards per carry allowed. Right? Well, why the difference? Well, here's why. Because their pass defense is terrible. Because their pass defense ranks 131st in all of college football. So guess what teams do when they go play Stanford? We're going to throw on them. So we're naturally going to not run as much because their pass defense is terrible.
Right.
So those are the things that you look at, Trev, and say you have to have proper context. And Indiana's not a highly ranked rushing defense because people throw on them. Now, you could say that part of it is because they have jumped on so many teams early that teams don't run on them as much. That's fair, but they still rank 2nd in all of college football in fewest yards allowed per attempt.
Mm-hmm.
And so no matter how you spin it, this is a really good rush defense that Notre Dame's going to have to be prepared for. So let's talk about why, Trev. And I think the thing that starts off is there's a lot of experience coming back in this system, in this defense. You have 2 starting defensive linemen. I think you're probably your 2 best defensive linemen, maybe 2 of your 3 best defensive linemen, Mikhail Kamara and then a James Carpenter. I think it's a debate whether who's better between Carpenter and CJ West. I think there's a debate between those two. But two of your 3 best defensive linemen are JMU transfers, and both starting inside linebackers are JMU transfers. So these are not, as we talked about yesterday, we need to reiterate, these aren't guys that you step in and say, hey, listen, your first-year starters, you're a bunch of portal guys. You all got to kind of come together. There's a lot of they already knew what they were doing coming into that game, coming into the season, which has helped them maybe catch up to speed a lot. So number 1 is experience, and number 2, this is a game plan. This is a defensive coordinator that has a great deal of awareness of who his players are. And he knows we can't line up against Ohio State and Michigan and even some of the other teams in the Big Ten schedule and just play, this is what we do. We're going to line up and play ball like Notre Dame does at times, right? See ball, fly to the ball, get to the ball. They can't do that. They don't have the personnel, and he knows this, to do that. And so what they do is they do a lot of things schematically to mess with you. They do a lot of things that they're just throwing different things at you you're not used to seeing from a run stopping standpoint. They trigger defenders from all over the field. Literally all 11 players on the field are potential run blitzing candidates. The way that they defend, they will, and you think a corner fire is not always meant to be a passing situation type of stop. They will do it on first, second down. Same thing with their safeties. Their safeties will come and fly downhill. Here's a little statistic for you, and we'll talk about this more when we get into the pass rush, Trevor. But Indiana's nickel this season came 44 times. Terry Jones came off the edge 44 times. Their other safety, Amari Farrell, came on pass rushes 23 times, and Sean Asbury, their other safety, came on a pressure 16 times. That's a lot of pressures, and some of those are obviously passing situations, but a lot of those, if you break down their film, they were in downs where it could have been a run or a pass. It was not I think they're passing, let's bring this guy. It was, this is our stunt, and it stops the run, and it stops the pass. If you want some context to that, Notre Dame's nickel, Jordan Clark, blitzed 9 times. Xavier Watts, one of their safeties, blitzed 13 times. Adon Schuler blitzed 13 times. So for context, all 3 of those aren't as much as their nickel came off the edge, because that's one of the things they do is they're going to overwhelm you with numbers against the run. They're going to do it from all over, so you don't know who's coming, and they do a lot of funky stuff where they'll kind of bait you into something to try to get you to go somewhere, and they're going to stunt right into where they're trying to bait you to run. So they're going to say, I'm going to line up here, right? We see this in basketball all the time. Like you play a guy and you give him the outside, you give him the left hand because you're trying to bait him to go left, right? And then when he goes left, you've got some sort of trap set up for him. Like that's what Indiana does in football. And so that's a big thing too, is they're very well schemed, and they know who their players are. They know they don't have a bunch of first-round NFL draft picks. And so they scheme that way, and they're very smart, and they play fast. Like when the ball snapped, these kids are flying to the football. And I think those are some of the ingredients that make this run defense as good as it is.
And to build off that point, when they fly to the football, they're experienced enough to where those don't turn into mistakes. I think that's the biggest thing for me for Indiana's defense is typically when you combine flying downhill as fast as they do and the lack of top-level athleticism that they don't have, typically you find some mistakes in there. You know what I mean? Like you see guys being out of position. You see guys flying into the alley and just missing tackles. We've seen that on Notre Dame's defense at times. And they have very athletic people on their defense. That's the thing with Indiana, is their defense is very fundamentally sound. They don't make mistakes mentally or physically. You know, they don't miss a lot of tackles. They fly to the football. They get multiple hats to the football. They're not out of position that much. And that's a testament to good coaching and players taking good coaching. So what they lack in top-end athleticism, they make up for in a really good scheme, a lot of experienced players who are smart, and they've seen a lot of different looks from a lot of different offenses. You rattled off how many snaps this team has had, you know, and so I think all of that kind of plays into a factor. They've seen a lot of different situations. So, again, you know, it would be doing this defense a disservice to say, well, they haven't played anybody and they have a bunch of FCS power group of 5 guys, right? Albeit they do, but they're playing at a really, really high level, and you got to watch them to see it.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's a G5 All-Star team. Most of those guys in the G5 All-Star League go to the NFL. I mean, we saw a corner from Toledo last year get drafted, I think in the first or second.
Yeah, to the Eagles.
Right? Yeah. So, I mean, you see that type of stuff all the time, Trevor. There's kids from that level that go, and that's what they did. That's what they brought. I don't know that they have any first-round draft picks, but there's guys that are going to play in the NFL on this defense. There's no question about it. So, very smart team. You see in the chat, well, that means a lot of misdirections and counters. I mean, that stuff's going to be a part of what you do, no doubt. But they're not, like, this is what Trev was saying, they're not this really undisciplined team where they're going to bring these 2 pressures and there's a vacated behind it. They do a good job of making sure that they don't have there's a lot of good gap integrity of what they're doing, because they're going to show you this junk look, but then they're going to move around to make sure that they're still have some gap integrity. You don't do what they've done without that, Trevor. I mean, and that's the thing is they are a sound defense. We keep saying this. They're a sound defense, even though it looks junky. It's a sound defense because they understand who they are. There's no doubt. And look, you look at where they rank. There is something to that, though. I mean, they also rank 40th in college football in most runs allowed of over 30 yards. But here's the crazy thing. So they rank there, but they rank 7th, in runs of 20 yards or more. So it's like boom or bust. If they give up a gain, it's going to be it's going to be something that's like you're either going to rip one off, and that's where I think Notre Dame is going to has a chance to have some success. Trevor, is this Indiana team was number 1 in the country in runs allowed of 10 yards or more, only 26. They are 7th in the country in yard gains of 20 or more, so 7, and then they're 40th in yards of 30 or more. And so Notre Dame's going to, can Notre Dame, this key matchup is, can Notre Dame find ways to rip off big gains, especially early? That's going to be the key, because you're not going to nickel and dime this defense, this rush defense to death. You're going to have to gash it.
Yeah.
There's going to be some -2s. There's going to be some +1s. There's going to be some 0s, but you got to hit it and that's where I think Notre Dame is a challenging matchup for Indiana, right? Because the concern I have is they have a really big physical nose in CJ West, and that type of player has given Notre Dame problems this year. We've seen it, right? We've seen it. They have a very stout physical edge combo in Linnell Carr and Malik Kamara, which at times has given Notre Dame's 290-pound offensive tackle some problems. So there's some things that they do that match up, that present some matchup concerns for Notre Dame. There's also some things that Notre Dame does in the run game that present problems for them. Number one being Notre Dame's 2 base runs are inside zone and duo, which means they're coming right at you. There's a greater opportunity to gash that than there is when you're doing some of the slower, longer developing stuff. There was a run I saw against Ohio State, and I'm trying to remember who the back was, but it might have been Junkins, it might have been Henderson. I don't remember who it was, but I'm watching this play, and they're running sort of a run, and Indiana's doing that baiting you to run, off tackle thing, Trevor, where they're just lined up inside, like with really tight splits from Kamara, and they're basically daring Ohio State to run. And I'm looking at it now, he's in a 4-eye technique. They slant inside, and they try to get the linebackers over, and they get to those 2 backs, and I'm looking at this saying, like, it was Junkins. I'm sitting there looking at it saying, if that's Jeremiah Love, he bounces this and it's gone. Do you have the all 22 of that game? That I didn't send you the – okay. Did I send you the defense of that? Anyway,
I might just –
It's a 1st and 10 play. It's earlier in the game. And if Jeremiah Love or Jadarian Price is the running back, they're bouncing that thing outside the tackle and it might go. But Judkins is not that kind of back, and he just kind of hammers it right into the back of the right guard and gains like 5 yards and just goes down. And that's the thing that Notre Dame's going to have to find some ways to do, is if you can get a body on a body against this defense, there will be run lanes that come open. And what Notre Dame has that really none of the teams that they faced have with any kind of consistency is that kind of back that can really rip you up and rip off those big plays and really gash you in those instances. And they not only have one of them, they have 2 of them. And that's the difference. So if Ohio State does that when Travion's in the game, then he's got a shot to rip them off, right? He's got a shot to really turn it into a big one, which, as you mentioned, he did. When Quinshon Judkins is in the game and that happens, you don't have that same opportunity. And they only gave Travion Henderson 9 carries in that game, Trevor. I mean, and so, he's not going to have those opportunities as much to make those type of big plays. And as you mentioned, he had that 39-yard run that basically put the game away, but they didn't use him a whole lot in that game. And so those opportunities weren't there as much. Notre Dame, no matter who's carrying the football, has a guy that can rip off those big plays. That's the counter to what they do. Yeah. And,
Yeah, I think that stat that you rattled off about, they're 1st in the country in yards of 10 or more, that you said they're 5th in the country in yards of 20 or more, and then 40th in runs of 30 yards or more. And that right there, that stat, I think encompasses what this defense is. They're really good from that 10 to 20 mark because they're very fundamentally sound. But once they have that back that is able to break into that next level, they don't have a Leonard Moore on their defense that can hawk somebody down. They don't have a Jaden Osbury that can hawk somebody down sideline to sideline. They don't have a Christian Gray, right? And so I think that to me, that stat right there speaks to they're really good when they keep stuff in front of them. The second something gets behind them, they're not catching them. And that's going to be the mismatch for IU, right? Is you're going to have to contain two of the most explosive running backs in all of college football with a defense that, they do really good at keeping in front of them. But Notre Dame's offense is really good at getting behind defenses. So, I mean, it's, again, you talked about the chess match yesterday, and they're going to have to do a really good job in scheming up some run plays to put them in those situations. Now, some of it is just going to be, Jeremiah Love hurdles a guy, Jadarian Price breaks 3 tackles, and then he sees a sliver and it's out the gate, right? So it will be a lot of that. But those stats are, I think, what speak the most to who this rush defense is. And that's not a knock. I mean, you're number one in the country in yards of 10 or more, that's crazy.
When you look at their tackling, according to Pro Football Focus, they have 110 missed tackles on the season. Notre Dame has 98. We think that Notre Dame's been a pretty good tackling team. That's about an average of 1 or more, right, per game than Notre Dame.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you consider the level of the competition, I think that is an area where they can be, I think, taken advantage of by some better teams. And they just haven't faced teams like that. And a lot of it, I mean, their linebackers, for example, whereas when you look at like Notre Dame's numbers, for example, their top 2 missed tackles guys are safeties. That's kind of what you expect because safeties are in space a lot more. Notre Dame has only 2 defenders that are in double digits in missed tackles. Don Schuler has 13 and Xavier Watts has 11. The next closest is Jaden Osbury at 7, who also plays in space a lot. And then after that, it's 6. If you look at Indiana's defense, they have 3 players in double digits, and their top guys is safety, but their next 2 guys are their inside linebackers who have 15 and 12 each. So I think those are areas where if they can get them in space, they can make those plays. Because I was having this, I think I shared this recently. I was having this conversation with a guy that covers Georgia Tech. He had me on the show the week before. He covers Georgia Tech and LSU. And it was a really fun interview, but we were talking after the game because he was talking about how just bad the tackling was. And I was like, hey, man, you might not want to be so hard on the Georgia Tech defense because that's kind of what everybody does. And I said, go ask Texas A&M and those athletes that they have what it's like tackling these kids in space. Like that's just – it's going to happen. You know what I mean? Your goal is to not let them get into the next level. And it's like, well, yeah, but you had that one safety for Georgia Tech that had Jadarian Price in the hole. And I was like, yeah, exactly. The next safety that brings Jadarian Price down in space in the hole with nobody else around him will be the first guy that brings Jadarian Price down in space with nobody around him. Like, it just doesn't happen, dude. That's like A&M couldn't do it. I mean, Louisville couldn't do it when they got in space. Even Northern Illinois, I mean, nobody could do it. Once they get in space, it's a wrap. I mean, that's just the way that it is. And that's what this group brings to the table. And that's something that Indiana has generally not faced at all this year. I think in my opinion, just looking at their opponents, Trevor, there's really only one running back that they faced all season that I believe is anywhere on the same level as what the Notre Dame running backs are from an explosiveness standpoint. And that guy, Travion Henderson, only carried the ball 9 times against them. Right? I mean, that's what they faced because they didn't face Jordan James. They didn't play Oregon. They didn't face Woody Marks. I mean, Jonah Coleman is not that type of back. He's probably the best running back they faced all year. And Jonah Coleman ran for 104 yards against them and 5.5 yards per carry against them. It's just the numbers overall look good because, I mean, they held Washington 116 yards rushing because they have an immobile quarterback that can't move, and they were able to shut it, and they had minus 24 rushing yards and other things like that. But when you look at it, Jonah Coleman went off in that game. You know, I mean, he had 100 yards in that game, and he's not the dynamic playmaker that the Notre Dame running backs are, right? So that's the thing as I look at it and I say they haven't really faced the kind of running back, the kind of talent that Notre Dame has. Jonah went for 46 yards, had a 46-yard gain in that game. And that's without a quarterback that presents any kind of rushing threat at all. No, well, I shouldn't say that because they bring in the Damon Williams kid off the bench and he'll just run kind of like, you know, the Bo Perbula kid does, the
like Alex Orji does.
Yeah, the kid from Stanford that they bring in. Which I never understood. As athletic as Ashton Daniels is, why they bring in another quarterback to run? It's very odd.
I know.
But that's the thing is they haven't faced a backfield like this. And every week we face some team whose opponents say, well, yeah, but they won't do that against our defense. And they do. And they need that to get going again in the postseason.
100%.
And we're going to find out if they're able to do that.
Oh, yeah, man. I mean, the stigma that Notre Dame doesn't have any fast guys so far up to this season has worked into Notre Dame's favor. You know, it's like, all right, yeah, you can think that. You know, I mean, I think it was the Virginia game where you and I were up in the press box and you leaned over to me and you're like, why do teams keep trying to hurt Notre Dame to the perimeter? They just can't.
Yes.
They can't, you know, and, you know, Riley Leonard talks all the time about, I just don't think defenses understand how fast I am, you know, and he's not saying that to like brag about himself. He's just like, I just see people take angles at me and like, they're just not, it's not the same angle that you would take to stop a Jeremiah Love.
Right.
Riley's not as fast as him, but it's still the same. Like, this is a fast football team, man.
Right.
And I think that stigma of Notre Dame just kind of has like the size and the strength, but they lack in the speed.
Right.
That narrative's played in their favor this year, man, because teams are just not ready for it.
Well, it's on both sides of the ball. I mean, to your point, what I was referring to you, as you mentioned, it was more of the Notre Dame defense because Virginia's trying to run these jet sweeps. And it's like, have you not been watching film? Did you not watch the Georgia Tech game when they tried to do this? And they got better athletes than you do for the most part at that stuff. And it just doesn't work. That stuff doesn't work against Notre Dame. You want to get outside of this defense, it's got to be a quick hitter. I mean, that's the only way you can get outside of this defense is those quick pitches where you suck everybody down and then you run that little quick pitch. A jet sweep is not getting outside of this defense. At least it hasn't all year to this point in time. I should probably not say that because then Indiana's going to go out and run a jet sweep for 50 yards. But it's true on both sides of the ball. And I think that's the thing that people don't realize is just how explosive the ball carries are for Notre Dame. But they're going to need their line to be at their best because this is the best defensive line this is the not only most productive but most talented defensive line that they faced probably since Louisville. Yeah, I think their overall D line is more talented than Georgia Tech. Zeke Biggers was a dude in that game, but the rest of their D line didn't really impress me talent wise. They're really well. They play hard. They're really well schemed. You probably have to go back to Louisville before you've played a defensive line with this kind of talent, in my opinion. So they're going to have to be on top of their game. They're going to have to be at their best against this. There's no doubt about that.